Hi everyone, we're just going to wait 10 or 20 seconds till everyone comes into the Zoom room. Just going to give it another few seconds. People are still coming in, so just bear with us while everyone comes into the room. Okay, well, welcome everyone. And I'd like to start by just acknowledging the country that I'm currently on. Today, I'm located in the Darawal Nation, and I acknowledge with deep respect the traditional custodians of this land, the Wadi Wadi people. I pay my respects to elders past and present and emerging, and to the Aboriginal community that continue to care for country. I stand for a future that profoundly respects and acknowledges Aboriginal perspectives, culture, language, and history, and a continued effort to fight for Aboriginal justice and rights, paving the way for a strong future. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Sarah O'Shea. I'm the Director of the National Centre for Student Equity in Higher Education, which we call NESHE for short. NESHE is housed at Curtin University and is funded by the Commonwealth Government with a dedicated mission to improving the higher education outcomes, that is access, participation, retention, success and completion rates for marginalised and disadvantaged people through a variety of strategies, including research, practice and policy. NESHE is very excited to be hosting Dr. Caitlin Barney's webinar, which is looking at how outreach staff might evaluate outreach programs for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students. Caitlin is one of our 2020 Equity Fellows. And this fellowship program that Caitlin is a part of has been running since 2016. And we provide support for targeted research within the equity field. So today, Caitlin has brought together a great panel to reflect upon this topic, which builds upon her NESHE fellowship, which focuses on increasing the impact of outreach programs. Each of the panelists today is an expert in the field. So we have Professor Maria Rossetti, who's the Director of the Indigenous and Transcultural Research Centre, and also an adjunct fellow at the National Centre for Student Equity in Higher Education. And also Professor Gwaine Bodkin-Andrews, who's of the Darawal Nation and is a researcher and lecturer promoting Aboriginal Australian standpoints and perspectives, and also a professor with the Centre for the Advancement of Indigenous Knowledges at the University of Technology, Sydney. Before we start though, I just have a few housekeeping details. Firstly, you will notice on your screen that we have a captioning, and the captioning is done by Bradley Reporting and will be recorded. This recording will be available in the coming days on the NESHE website. To activate the closed captions, click the CC button in the toolbar, and that should either be at the bottom or the top of your screen, and that way you can follow along in captions. We have also have capturing via browser, and Nina will add that link to the chat pod now. If you have any technological difficulties, then please email neshe@curtin.edu.au. We've planned for each of the speakers to speak for about 15 to 20 minutes with some time for discussion at the end. But please start the session by going into the chat pod and introducing yourself. We have registrants from all over the country and beyond, so it's nice to meet each other. Perhaps you could also identify the country you're currently located on as well in your introduction. Please though choose all panelists and attendees when you post. If you have a question for the panel, please add that question to the Q&A box, and you can vote on questions as well that have been posed by others. Okay, well that finishes the housekeeping. I'm going to pass over now to Caitlin to introduce the research. Over to you, Caitlin.
Thanks, Sarah, and hi everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'd just like to also start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands where I am today and pay my respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue to have strong spiritual and cultural connections to country. I also want to acknowledge and thank the members of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Advisory Group that have worked with me on this fellowship as well, and thank them for their support and advice. As Sarah mentioned, the focus of the fellowship's been around building further evidence around what works in outreach programs and also how they could be strengthened. And originally I had planned to have a national symposium as part of the fellowship that was to be a face-to-face event, but obviously due to COVID that wasn't possible. So in part this webinar is instead of having that national symposium, but also one of the themes that came through interviews with outreach staff was there's a need for more data to be gathered and more evidence around how to measure the impact of outreach programs. So this webinar today is part of a suite of resources that I'm developing as part of the fellowship to assist outreach staff. Originally, we had 3 speakers, but unfortunately, Professor Kathy Clapham was unable to join us today, but we still have 2 fantastic speakers today. So the first presenter is Professor Maria Rossetti. As Sarah mentioned, she is the Director of the Indigenous and Transcultural Research Centre at the University of Sunshine Coast. Maria was also part of the Australian Government Departmental Task Force that was assisting with the 2019 National Regional Rural and Remote Tertiary Education Strategy. She's also a Principal Fellow of the Higher Education Academy in the UK, and she's undertaken a number of large-scale projects that have produced meaningful and impactful outcomes. So thank you, Maria.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and welcome to everybody. I'm coming to you today from the most beautiful Gubbi Gubbi country here on the Sunshine Coast, and there's a great image behind me there. I wish to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on which we are all coming from today, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'm an Aboriginal woman. I'm a descendant of the Kalkadoo Thankwith Walgaman peoples. And as I said, I take much joy in living, working and playing here on Gubbi Gubbi country on the Sunshine Coast. So I'm a Professor of Marketing, and what that means is what I'd like to share with you today is some of the tools and tricks around evaluation, really to get people started. So I teach marketing, and I teach an area called social marketing, which is about behavioural change to bring about improvements in people's quality of life. I've also worked previously in an Indigenous centre, and obviously are connected to what types of Indigenous outreach activities occur. So I thought I'd put this together in sort of 5 simple steps as a way to get people started, and to give you some ideas or templates as to ways that you can engage in evaluation of your outreach program, be it a camp or any other type of activity. So probably wanted to kick off with why evaluation matters. So I guess working in universities, we know that there's always this pressure to demonstrate success and to provide evidence for this. And during COVID and post-COVID, we know that this is going to be even more important. They're looking at ways, for example, and what evaluation does for us is it provides that ongoing check about our strategies and tactics. It tells us what's working, but it tells us what isn't. So it's actually a really critical part of not only maintaining our programming going forward, but it's a bit like keeping your finger on the pulse, knowing whether it's going in the right direction. For those of you who've worked in Indigenous outreach for many years, you'll know that cohorts change. As different generations come through the system, they have different experiences and different views, and just different outlooks. So what it means with evaluation is that even if we ran the same program for the last 5 years, what students are coming in with, their expectations of and what they're looking for may be different. So evaluation provides us this opportunity to keep our finger on the pulse, to demonstrate success, but also so that we know that what we're doing is working. It allows us to improve our program design and implementation, and the all-important element of this, which is impact, which is what we're looking for. Was it effective? So Indigenous outreach, and I've got the elephant there because I think there's an elephant in the room when we often talk about measuring and evaluating success in universities. what we know is that Indigenous outreach success is defined differently by different stakeholders, and this sometimes creates a bit of a tension. Sometimes outreach staff are being asked about how many students they were able to recruit or to convert as a result of the camp experience, yet that may not have been the singular purpose of it. So this really creates tensions, and as you're developing your evaluation strategy, what the goal is to stop and think about the different stakeholders that you're going to be sharing this information with and what they think success is. That way you can capture the data and information that they're looking for, so you can share with them that information. Now, some may be looking at success in different ways. So for a school or for the parents, it may be about the level of engagement for that person in that space. I'm going to share with you a few questions as well that you can ask. So give you a real toolkit, if you like, to help you move forward. But I guess that what I'm making with this one is there are competing tensions. It's not going to go away. So the smart thing to do is develop your evaluation and collect the data you need for various stakeholders so that you have that at hand. Now, as we all know, figuring out what, when, where, and how to evaluate is not easy. And evaluation can take many forms. Probably one of the biggest things we see here in higher education is that any type of outreach with school students in particular, because there's a time lag between them experiencing the outreach program and then making the decision to come to university, it can make it really challenging to figure out the relationship between your program and them coming. So is there a causal relationship, or was it a number of other touch points and other factors that came into their decision process? So what it means is that when we approach evaluation, it's best to be multidimensional and multi-pronged. And I'll show you a table about how you can do that. So I've put together these 5 steps. First of all, this idea is from the outset, actually visualize the big picture of your program. What are the inputs and what are you trying to get out of it? And what does impact mean? Once you have this big picture, it actually helps you to move forward to the next step, which is actually conducting a self-evaluation. It's important to do this because I know that sometimes staff who are conducting outreach are new or have moved on or have taken on a different role. So as a part of this self-evaluation, it's important to look back and say, what lessons have we learned and what can we do better next time? Then it's the planning, then implement and analyse, and finally sharing. And not just sharing with those within the university, but sharing that with participants and external partners, such as parents and schools. So this creates a really comprehensive process, as you can see. And so I believe the slides are available on the NESHE website and that you can download them as in a PowerPoint form, which means you can actually grab these images off of them and use them. So one of the things is called a logic model. Now, this is a really great visual picture of the program. And it's a great way to have it at the beginning because it actually gets you to stop and say, okay, what are the inputs? What are the resources that we're using in this particular outreach program? What are the actual activities that we're doing? Now, the reason I pause on those two is that often they're the only data that we have. So it's about extending your evaluation to cover everything in the big picture. We want to look at the outputs. So how many people participated? I'll show you an example on the next slide. And outcomes, what happened? Did they change their behaviour? Did they engage more? Did they have positive things to say? And finally, the all-important impact. Did we make an impact in the decision-making for that student? Is that student going to come to university or are they going to go to our university? So I've put together this mock-up as an example of this big picture. So just an idea, so I just threw some words in there to give you a starting point. So you can see here I focused on outreach camps because that was the focus of Caitlin's work. So a camp input, for example, you might say, well, it's the dollars that we put together for staff, for catering, for accommodation, for travel, for incentives. So we generally have a budget that we can work with, which we can say are a part of our inputs. Then we have our activities. So you might have, for example, on day 1, a welcome, on day 2, an academic activity, on day 3, a cultural activity. So just briefly identify these in this big picture visualization. Then focus on the camp outputs itself. How many people participated? Did their confidence improve? Did they have greater clarity about what they want to do after school or whether the program that they looked at was for them? and general satisfaction with the camp as well. You know, was it a good experience? Did they meet other people? Then we look at, this is where I separate these two things out, because the camp outputs are really the focus of what the Indigenous Service Centre might be looking at, whereas university is looking for outcomes. They're looking mostly around the view that, was there an intention to attend your university itself? So if you had 20 people come along, how many of them are likely to come along and join, enrol at your university? And will they be sharing positive word of mouth about your university with fellow students, their school, their parents when they return? Now you'll see here with the last one, I've called it WP, or widening participation impact. So I've separated those two out because, again, the widening participation agenda is about increasing the participation of Indigenous students in higher education and, of course, their success through higher education as well. So by separating these out, you can see that you have camp inputs, activities and outputs. You then have university outcomes, so that's addressing those stakeholders' views and needs, and also WP impact, which of course is important because it shows very much our social objective has been met. Now, the second step is actually asking questions of yourself or your team that's working on it, or people who previously were running the camp. And I've put forward here 4 really powerful questions, and that's all you really need. And take the time to work through them, because it's important not to just jump into the next outreach activity without looking back and reflecting on what happened in the past one. So the first question, do we fully understand the expectations of our camp participants and their families? Now that's an important one. As I mentioned, expectations change over time. The sector changes over time, education, society changes over time. So do you fully understand what people are expecting when they're coming along to this, and what their parents, families and extended community are expecting from your activity? The second question, do we fully understand how going to university is situated within the lives of our targets or our participants? And that's really key, because obviously in a COVID world, we know that people's decision making is a little bit different to what it was pre-COVID. But do we understand about what else is happening in their lives? How important is it for them to go to university? Or, you know, do they have other competing agendas, things competing for their attention and time? So this really is a question about what we call in social marketing, competition. Competition for the attention, the energy, the emotions, the focus of the target audience. The third question, do we fully understand the barriers and enablers facing our camp participants? Again, these can change over time. So it's important that you take that time to sit down and understand, well, what are some common questions that they might ask about barriers, and what are some enablers such as scholarships or bursaries that we can share with them that will help them? And the last question, the important one, what do we learn from the last camp and have made changes to, and what changes have we made to address these? Absolutely key that even if you're new to taking on an outreach program, that you spend that time self-evaluating at the first instance. The third step along is the plan itself. Okay, so we've got our big picture, we've asked ourselves some hard questions, and now we can start to put the plan together. Evaluation occurs across all phases of an outreach program. It's not just something you do at the end. So it's important from before they even attend, through the process of the experiences of the camp, for example, and then at the end that there are questions asked, observations made, and evaluations occur. It's important that your evaluation isn't only focused on your camp participants, okay, but you consider all other partners as well. So a partner might be the academics who are delivering the content for your participants in your camp. It may actually be your ambassadors that are helping people to settle in and spending time with them. It may be people at the accommodation, if you're using accommodation, who can give some feedback on how things are going, questions that have been asked, for example. And it also includes the school. Did you communicate well with them? What could you do better next time? And of course, the parents and families that sit around as well. So what this does is you start to see that evaluation isn't just a singular focus on the participant, but instead it's all stakeholders across the program. I will show you a tool on the next phase that will make this all seem a little bit simpler. The main thing too is that you want to compare your outreach programs with previous offerings that you had to show change over time. We call this baseline. So it's important to say, if you've got data from the last 3 or 5 years, that you're able to look at those, the number of participants, where they come from, what programs they've looked at. Having this baseline is important because it can demonstrate growth over time, show you areas where you've improved with each new sort of offering of a camp. Now, there's no one best method of collecting data. I'm going to share with you today some really simple ways of collecting data. It doesn't have to be super sophisticated. It doesn't require, you know, excessive data analysis or anything like that, but rather it's about getting the right data and then drawing the story together about it. So here's an example of a planning table or an evaluation table. So you should be able to download this when you download the slides. Now, what it shows you, I'll just start over on this side, hopefully you can see my mouse, is that I've divided the evaluation up into different phases: pre-camp, and then each day's activities, so broadly speaking, and then a follow-up in the week after as well. So by breaking it down into these, it doesn't seem so overwhelming and you have a plan of attack. As you can see across the top, you're looking at what you're evaluating, who, when, and how. So a simple table like this can make what can sometimes be a daunting process a much more focused endeavour. So in the pre-camp, now this is something that perhaps you might not have thought of, is that when people are enrolling and starting to give details to join up, you might ask them some questions around their confidence and their academic ability or cultural identity. Now, Wayne will talk a little bit more about this. This is a really interesting piece, topics from his area. So, and who you might ask is the participant themselves, and you can do that at the point they confirm their attendance. Now, I'll show you a way to do some really brief online surveys, and you can do them through your phone for your participant. So it's actually not that difficult to put together. The main thing is keep the surveys brief and keep them focused on the key questions that matter to you, okay? With day 1, for example, you might be focused in on evaluating how people are settling in and are they making connections, you know, how are they feeling in that space? But rather than ask the participants themselves, you might ask the ambassadors or the staff, for example, at the accommodation places or other staff that are there on the day to help welcome people as they come in. And you might actually do it differently. Rather than a survey, you might have observation notes. So say, as your ambassadors are signing off for the day, that they have to write down a few notes and a few questions, which I'll show a few in a little bit, about what they observed. How well were people settling in? How did it compare to previous experiences that they had? And identifying maybe some areas that could be improved or areas that need to be looked after. With the activities, as you go down, you can see I've identified different partners. So here we've got academics, and it might just be a phone interview. It might just be 2 or 3 questions. How did things go today? What were the top 3 questions you were asked? What do you think we could do better next time? We might, for example, then with cultural activities, look at how this enriches participants' cultural identity. And you'd ask this of the participants. And you can do this via Mentimeter, which is a simple mobile phone survey app that you can use. I'll show you one a little later. Farewell. And then lastly, we might be looking at the overall experience and impact, but we might actually be asking the parents and the school themselves. So what do the principals or the liaison officers hear when students came back? So this follow-up is absolutely critical. It's really important that you don't leave it too far. I'd say about a week after the camp is finished that you've come back and gotten in contact. Really important to do this to show that there's an ongoing connection between the university, the camp staff, outreach staff, and the participants themselves. You might also share this experience with parents too. And that's, I think, an important one to see how parents or what parents or guardians are hearing when participants have returned home. So here are some questions. I won't go through all of them. There's a few there, but I thought I'd put a few together just to give you a starting point. So simple, did the camp, this is obviously questions for the participants themselves. Did the camp meet your expectations? An important one too, so Caitlin's work identified that the connections made between students at the camps was really important and really valuable. So you might ask a question, will you stay in contact with the other students that you met at the camp? What aspect of the camp did you find most useful? Now, I like this next one. It's one I use when I'm teaching. What did you learn that surprised you? That's sort of that nice little learning gain in there. And then some really focused ones. Did the camp help you clarify what you wanted to do when you finished school? How likely is it that you will go to university? How likely is it that you will come to our university? Would you recommend the camp to others? And the last one, just to keep it simple, if you could change just one thing about the camp, what would it be? So this is just a starting point. You may only pick 2 or 3 questions out of there to go forward, but I thought I'd just give you some words, I guess, around that. Now, for our internal partners, so this might be academics or student ambassadors that are helping with the program. What worked well? How engaged were the participants during your time with them? What were the top 3 questions you were asked? So by phrasing questions like that, the top 3 questions or the one thing we could do better, it actually just gives you the most salient responses that you're after. Like it gives you those high leverage points. The 4th one down there, were the resources and training that we provided for you helpful? And I think that's an important one because that is marking back to your inputs, what inputs you gave with training both ambassadors and academic, and what could we do better next time? And some questions to parents and schools. Again, how satisfied were you with our communication about the camp? Was the camp a good experience for your child/student? Did you feel that the camp helped your child/student to decide what they wanted to do after they finished school? Did it help enrich their cultural identity? And that's something that Gwen will talk a bit about in his presentation. How likely is it that your child will attend university after they finish school? What do we do well? And if there's just one change to the camp, what would it be? So some nice sort of pointy questions there. I hope that they're helpful. The next part is once you've got that evaluation table together, you've got a few questions, then it's about implementing it and then analysing as you go. You don't necessarily need to be able to use SPSS or other data analysis tools. I think simpler is the better. And if you're using open-ended questions, you simply can draw out the key themes. What were the top 3 questions, for example, that were asked of academics or ambassadors? You should be able to narrow those down just manually, just by looking at the data themselves. And with some of the other questions, if you have it on a rating scale of sort of 1 to 5, you're able to easily analyse that material. And I think that simple analysis, don't be intimidated by analysis, but that simple analysis will help give more insights and data to your various stakeholders. The last step is sharing. Now, sharing is really key because it's not just about sharing a report or a summary within the Indigenous unit itself, but it's also with the university too. Beyond that, it should also be shared with the participants, the schools, and the parents. I think that's really important that you share with all partners. Now, on the side here on this slide, you can see I've created this really simple infographic, and I created it in Canva, which is freely accessible to anybody. And it's just an infographic summary that could be sent out to the school liaison officers, to the school principals, to the parents, to the teachers, and you might have something this on the front of a more comprehensive report that you share with university executive, for example. So as you can see, it says who participated, what they liked, what were the top 3 things they liked, how did their confidence grow, so before their camp confidence and their camp confidence when they finished, and what parents and schools thought about the experience. And as you can see, I made up my little website, best camp ever. So look, thank you for that. I hope that was insightful and interesting. And I'll pass over now to Caitlin. Thanks, Caitlin.
Thank you, Maria. You made some really useful points in relation to why evaluation matters, and also some great suggestions on the kinds of questions outreach staff can ask themselves first when they're setting up evaluations. And you also made some good suggestions around the kinds of data staff might collect and then share. And I think an important question is around, once you've gathered that data, what do you then do with it, and how do you ensure that it's empowering Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people? And that links well to our next speaker, who's going to talk about some of the complexity of this in relation to Indigenous data sovereignty and the usefulness of data. So Professor Gwain Bodkin Andrews is Darawang Nation and is a researcher and lecturer at University of Technology, Sydney, and focuses on promoting Aboriginal standpoints and perspectives, particularly in education and psychology. And he's led numerous research grants, and his projects are focusing around a diverse range of topics, and particularly with the development of a strong foundation in Indigenous research methodologies. And from this work, he's continually developing his experience in applying quantitative and qualitative research methods within his work. So thank you, Gwaine. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Caitlin. Before I begin, please bear with me. I just wish to offer an acknowledgement to country. Gaba, Radadani do Billy Mineo, Nindio Minion, Galamban, Daro Bidigolo Nada Madigo to Raleigh, Tiawa, Daro Nagun, Uingo, Galamandalo Nalawa, Owa, Dinga Dugo, Gu Tia, Gu O, Guba, Dinga Dugo. Roughly translated, my apologies, I'm aware I wear the mask of white privilege, but I ask that you understand that I was born and raised as Darawal on bitter and freshwaters lands. And as part of our protocols, I wish to offer my deepest respect for the country I'm now sitting on, this Darawal country. And I also wish to offer my respect to its elders of the past and present and those emerging in the future. And yeah, I also offer my respect to the Aboriginal peoples and Torres peoples and some Maori, possibly First Nation scholars in the list as well. So yeah, thank you for coming, and to the non-Indigenous colleagues, it's always good to have you listening as well. And thank you, Caitlin and Sarah, for inviting me. I just am going to stress right now an early point that Marie made in their excellent presentations, practical and powerful, and that is the multiple stakeholders. And the point of this actual presentation, I guess, will focus on too often when we get caught up in our fancy methods and methodologies and the expectations from government agencies, university, the need for evidence, that sometimes the stakeholders, the most important stakeholders, tend to get forgotten. And in this case, we're thinking about our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students, and also Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities who will be connected to this research. And so I'm just going to talk about these particular tensions and the need to really prioritise Indigenous governance and decision making within any project, particularly research evaluations and outreach programs. And I'm going to draw from my own experience and some of my own stuff ups as well, I guess early on in my research career. And yeah, hopefully that will drive the message home. So please bear with me, and hopefully I'll get a decent message across and don't send you all to sleep. All right, is this working? No, I'm going to use that. Sorry, my apologies. Oh, there we go. Okay. Now, in the Indigenous research setting, it's often cited within a lot of papers that you read that there's a lot of mistrust from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities about research itself. And more often than not, this is actually focused on quantitative data, particularly. And I guess the problem there is, as researchers or potential researchers, we have to overcome this mistrust, but we also have to understand why this mistrust exactly exists. Maori scholar Tahu Kukutai and Palo scholar Maggie Walter actually highlight this particular issue in terms of the hierarchy of what they call Indigenous data. And in this case, we have an ideal scenario where the data desert, where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are erased from all data or all research, is the least desirable. And then we move up this ladder where we have data about us, which is where we have non-Indigenous researchers and so forth coming in and just researching from their epistemic foundations or their Western standpoints and making decisions and basically making policy and practice from that. Then we have data that's more closely aligned with us or for us, and then data with us, where researchers, whether they be Aboriginal or non-Indigenous, are more carefully walking with Aboriginal communities, Aboriginal scholars and Aboriginal representatives. And then the top of the data, according to Kukutai and Walter, is the data by us. So data that's led by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, Maori peoples, First Nations peoples. And this is the pinnacle of data, and I would argue the data we need to look out for, regardless of the method that's being used. Maggie Warder argues, though, that too often, in terms of hierarchy, the most populous is the data about us and or the data desert. So that is where Aboriginal and Torres Strait peoples and communities have little say in the direction of research, what's being measured and so forth. And this is a trend that needs to stop altogether. Unfortunately, though, even if we have a look at the data by us or data with us, there is still immense dangers, particularly within the quantitative research setting, so where we're using scale measurements and so forth. And that is where we come into the research still with the wrong epistemic or the wrong foundations or standpoints, or basically looking from the perspective of Eurocentric research, if that makes any sense. One of the most influential papers for me in highlighting this is by fellow scholar Maggie Warder, who talks about even quantitative data that's meant to be neutral and so forth, and impartial, is highly political and highly biased. And she highlights three particular biases in such data that can affect our evaluations and our research. And that is ideological evidence. An example she highlights is from Hughes and Hughes, who talk about NAPLAN data, and they suggest that Aboriginal students within metropolitan settings have closed the gap and there's no work that's needed here. And all the work needs to be done in remote Aboriginal and Torres Strait communities. But if you look more carefully at the data, that this is actually more of an ideological bias where they misrepresent the lived experiences of Aboriginal students within metropolitan settings. Simplistic understandings of data is where we approach the data too uncritically, and often we can get excited about results that really don't tell the whole picture. And the example Maggie highlights is a report on Indigenous unemployment, where the rate of Indigenous unemployment actually lessened over time, and they were celebrating this, but the problem was when you look at non-Indigenous unemployment rates, that actually fell even further. So technically speaking, the gap actually widened. And then finally, probably a big one that I'm quite passionate about is what's known as the orthodoxy of dichotomy. And that's basically the comparisons between non-Indigenous versus Indigenous students. And too often these comparisons actually favour, or almost always favour, non-Indigenous students. And that's because our measures and our outcomes come from non-Indigenous perspectives. So we have to be very careful there. One movement that's starting to address these limitations within quantitative data, and this is a really big movement that's happening quite strongly in New Zealand, from the work of Tai Kukatai. There's quite a few Maori scholars are very strongly on board. And then there's Stephanie Rain Carroll, who I think is within a First Nation scholar within Canada, and the US as well. Some excellent work being done here. And that's the notion of Indigenous data sovereignty. And really the take-home message about this, there's two key messages. One, we need to really understand what is Indigenous data. Too often we just limit it to, say, for example, we ask questions of Aboriginal and Torres Strait peoples, and that's all Indigenous data is, and that's not necessarily the case. Indigenous data sovereignty takes the idea that data is much more expensive if it affects Aboriginal and Torres Strait peoples or communities. It is Indigenous data. If it affects policy that affects us, it is Indigenous data. So we're looking at data on our resources, such as our lands, waters, and so forth. We're looking at data about our basic demographics, health, and so forth. And then we're looking at our cultural data that's coming from our standpoints and epistemology, such as, I guess, our oral histories and so forth. So this is all Indigenous data because it can all have an impact upon us, and we have to keep that in mind. So Indigenous data sovereignty then, with this foundation of Indigenous data, then moves on to the notion of governance and decision making, and this is critically important. And that's basically the right of Indigenous peoples to determine the means of the collection, access, analysis, interpretation, management, dissemination, and reuse of data pertaining to Indigenous peoples, from who it's being derived, and who it shall be related to, and who it should affect. So in that regard, Indigenous data sovereignty is about our collective rights to make decisions about data that will affect us, regardless of what type of data that is. And I'm of the very strong opinion that all Indigenous research, including evaluations, must be at the very least have a shared governance with Indigenous representatives, community members, scholars, and so forth. In 2018, I think this was, the Australian Division of Indigenous Data Sovereignty, the Mayam Nadir Wingara Indigenous Data Sovereignty Collective, held a summit where we had over 40 Indigenous representatives from, and these are leaders, CEOs in Indigenous organisations and research collectives. We came together in Canberra and we spoke about, well, what is Indigenous data sovereignty from an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspective? And we also had some very strong presentations by some Maori scholars as well, who were very helpful in guiding the discussions. And there was 5 key conclusions that came out of it, and it's all centred around how Indigenous peoples, communities and representatives can help and ideally govern data and research about us. And so therefore making the data with us, for us and by us. And the first one is a notion of having control of the data ecosystem. So basically we should have a voice from the creation or the very idea of the research in the first place, and we should have decision making there, to the dissemination of the data, and as Maggie argued earlier, the reuse of data as well. So what's going to happen after the project is over. This is critically important. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voices should not be left out in any stage of this, nor should they be reduced to a minority in government. So I personally argue it should at least be a 51% Indigenous majority decision makers within any research project. The second one is data is contextual and must be disaggregated. So data needs to not only respect the immense diversity of our people, so move beyond the Indigenous or not the dichotomy, but it needs to respect where the research takes place, so our country, our place, and it must also protect our peoples, whether it be anonymity and so forth, but also it should not do any harm for our peoples and communities. The next key finding was data needs to be relevant and it must be empowering. And the results of data needs to be empowering for our peoples and communities. So therefore it needs to strengthen our voices and yes, give us a say in not only how it's collected, but how this data can be used for our peoples and our communities and our future generations, most importantly. And the data structures have to be held accountable to Indigenous peoples and representatives. And so this means if there's ethics applications to be written, there needs to be consultation before, during and after ethics itself, and that needs to be accountability there. The storage of data is critically important. One thing we often forget about is the notion of capacity development as well. There are research projects. We should be bringing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's representatives with us and possibly using this as a training exercise as well to further strengthen future Indigenous researchers. And then finally, the data needs to be protective and respect individual and collective interests. So data needs to be part of the emancipation project. Help us overcome the negative impacts of colonisation, must be for our benefit, and researchers, whether they're Indigenous or not, must be held accountable at all stages of the research. So now I'm going to move on to my early research where I wasn't even aware of Indigenous data sovereignty. And I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but what I'm trying to warn you about is I got caught up in some very high level statistics, which was all about cultural representativeness or cultural appropriateness. And so basically I was given a whole heap of Western orientated measures about student self-perceptions, and I was asked by my supervisor to apply them to Indigenous and non-Indigenous students and help identify, technically speaking, what was wrong with Indigenous students and why they were not performing well. And so what I used was a measure of self-perceptions that looked at 12 different dimensions. Now, as I said, these were Western orientated measures. We're looking at math, verbal and school self-confidence, general self-esteem, physical abilities and so forth. And these statistics, all they say is the results, they're equally applicable to Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal students. They're equally understood, so there is no misrepresentation, at least statistically speaking. There is a huge problem with this research in that it was from a Western orientated measure. It was not culturally, I won't say valid, but it wasn't from our culture. It wasn't with us. It wasn't by us. It was from a Western perspective. And this leads on to a second paper I wrote, and this is where the damage really took part. Is I wrote this paper, or drafted in 2009, got it published in 2012, had a really unfortunate title, Explaining Away Aboriginality. And what I tried to prove in this paper was that if we look at Indigenous students' rates of disengagement and compare it to non-Indigenous students tend to disengage more. And it's a repeated finding over and over again. And so how can we close this gap, so to speak? And the key variable I used was actually whether Indigenous and non-Indigenous students were confident at school. That is, they're confident in their abilities and their feelings about school. And basically I found once you controlled for differences in confidence at school, the differences in disengagement disappeared. So the moral of the story was all we have to do is increase Indigenous students' actual confidence at school. Sounds like a really great finding, but still it's based on the foundation of Western-based measures, Eurocentric measures. So I was invited onto a project with the Australian Indigenous Mentoring Experience, and this is where I started to criticise my actual previous research. And AIM has done some excellent work within the mentoring, Indigenous mentoring research space, and had some really powerful results. Sorry. And basically the research looked at a whole heap of measures, and finally we included an Indigenous epistemic measure in how confident were the Aboriginal kids in the classroom. And what was really great is AIM saw the Aboriginal students who took part having an increased sense of confidence about their identity in the classroom, but also an increased sense of confidence in their school self-concept and so forth, and a whole heap of other Western measures as well and Western outcomes. I was still uncomfortable with this, and this is complicated, but basically I wanted to know, well, what is the strongest predictor or protector for stopping Indigenous students disengaging? And the answer was school self-concept. And there were some other variables that were protective as well against disengaging from school, but also there was a very weak, but also a protective factor about Aboriginal identity in the classroom. So the more confident Aboriginal kids were in the classroom, the less likely they would disengage from school. But there was still something wrong with this. I was taking the wrong approach. And the moral of the story I found is I interrogated the data a little bit more, and I found that one of the strongest predictors of Aboriginal students being confident at school was how safe they were in the classroom about their identity. So their strength of identity was a really strong predictor of stronger levels of school self-concept, which then became an even stronger protective factor against Indigenous students disengaging from school. So basically we have this Indigenous measure working with a non-Indigenous measure to produce something even more powerful. So I want you to keep that in mind when you're designing your research evaluations and so forth. It's so important to consider research from our own perspectives. And just for the final slide, I'm a little bit over time, but I'll finish it off, is we need to have a look out of, well, even these quantitative measures are too simplistic. Just asking students, oh, do you feel good about being Aboriginal in the classroom, is not enough. It's still way too general. So my point here is you're looking at research by Kondamuka scholar Karen Martin, where she found some of the most important traits about what it means to be Aboriginal and what's important about being Aboriginal to be passed on to children was the notion of family history, pride and identity, food practices, showing respect and knowing country. There's a seminal work of Noongar scholar Cheryl Cricket-Tucker, where she found when she asked the Aboriginal students themselves, or the youth themselves, they came up with 30 different facets 30 different ideas that were important to them about what it meant to be Aboriginal. And it moves well beyond just feeling good about being Aboriginal, so to speak. And I'm just going to highlight this actual, I'm not sure if you can see the pointer, but the figure with the three colours, red, yellow and green. And in this particular project that I was involved in, we actually formulated a measure looking at different facets of what it meant to be Aboriginal for Aboriginal students. And we worded it in a way that also non-Indigenous students could answer these questions as well. So we had a general about my culture and so forth. I'm just going to refer back to my earlier research about these non-Indigenous self-perceptions and self-concepts. Of those 12 dimensions, I think 9 of them, non-Indigenous students were significantly stronger, and Indigenous students were less than non-Indigenous students. Remember, these are Western measures. In this study where we centered on Aboriginal standpoints and how we measured the items, the red and the yellow are actually Aboriginal student respondents in 2 separate groups, and the green is a non-Indigenous respondents. And you can see across the board, the Indigenous students, regardless of which group, had stronger sense of identity than non-Indigenous students. So we've kind of like reversed the results depending on how we ask the questions and from whose standpoints we ask the questions. So keep that in mind for your research. And here's an idea of some of the questions we asked, and maybe don't use this, they're relatively simplistic. If you want, feel free, but adapt them. Ask your students, ask your Aboriginal representatives what are important, what will be important to measure from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander standpoints. And I will call it quits there if that's okay. Don't forget our Aboriginal stakeholders and our Torres Strait Islander stakeholders. That's what's most important. Thank you.
Wayne. You made some really important points about the importance of Indigenous data sovereignty, and also the importance of really considering the data rights and interests of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and ensuring that they're secured. We've only got a couple of minutes for questions, so if anyone wants to put one in the Q&A, please feel free to do that. And Maria and Gwen are both happy to answer questions after today's webinar. But I have a question or two I'd like to ask you, Maria and Gwen, if Maria, you'd like to join us again. Maria, I really liked how you talked about the who, what, when and how of evaluation, and you used that really useful table. Could staff use that template to map out their plan, and do you know of other resources they could draw on?
Yeah, absolutely. Feel free to use that. The image at the top, the logic model, the big one, that actually comes from the Center for Disease Control in the US, and it's actually used a lot in social marketing, broadly speaking, no matter what the cause is, because it's just a great way of presenting your information. And so those resources have come from social marketing resources that I use, so feel free to use that table. I think it's just a nice way. Another resource, and I'll quickly share with you, I mentioned about ways to do a survey that's relatively easy, that doesn't require a lot. So one I use is Mentimeter. Some of you may have used Mentimeter before. Just got to move this out the road. And so it's a free service, and we often use it when we're teaching. Now with Mentimeter, you can create your own you can create your own survey. So these are some that I just created 6 minutes ago, just to show you. And when you can go into it, I'll just give you a little quick tour. You actually can add your questions by adding a slide, and then you can say over here what type of slide it is. So if I just pop down, I might say add a slide, and you'll see it gives me all these options: multiple choice, a short answer quiz, whatever. Now, when you put your, once you've created it, you can then open your survey up, and this is how it works. So Mentimeter is an app, so you can have your participants download the app onto their phone, and all they do is they go into Mentimeter. They can even just go through the browser and they put this code in. So if any of you are super keen out there, you could type the code into Mentimeter and you literally answer the question on your phone right there in real time. So it's really quick, it's really simple, and you get a nice little summary of the results there, and freely available as well. The fact that you can deliver it on a phone, I think, is just even better. So if you get your students, participants to do that, that's easy. Now I did the little infographic just using Canva, again, a free online accessible infographic creator. So when you log in, you can create, so this is the one I created down here.
And I'll just open it up, and you've got lots of different options of layouts and things like that. You can type it up, and you can put those out too. So yeah, just wanted to share those with people as accessible ways. I think Mentimedia in particular is really quite cool.
That's great, Maria. That's really useful. And Gwen, I just wanted to ask you in relation to Indigenous data sovereignty, are there useful resources or publications you'd recommend for outreach staff to learn more about that?
Yeah, what's great about the movement is they're actually producing a lot of open access works, which are quite accessible. Won't say it's an easy read though, but I would argue probably your first starting point, and it's mentioned within the latest round of the IAS's ethics, will be to start with the most basic of protocols and most important protocols as well in research altogether. So there is a section in Indigenous data sovereignty within the latest edition of IAS's ethics, but what's really important about this is the emphasis on Aboriginal community and Aboriginal-led research. So please never forget that. In terms of the movement itself, just very quickly, there's the Mayan Ngāti Wingata Indigenous Data Sovereignty Collective webpage, and there's some easily accessible information on that. But we also have a couple of open access edited books. Tahu Kukutai and John Taylor released one, and it's freely available from ANU in 2016. And that's a great open access resource. The whole book is free, at least to download. And then there's one that's just been released, lead edited by Maggie Water and Tahu Kukutai, I think, just this year. And yeah, I strongly advise getting that. Tahu Kukutai paid a small fortune to make sure it's open access so everyone can read it in that regard. So yeah, find some good reading there, hopefully.
Thank you. Great. Sarah's us, so we're almost run out of time. But thank you, Gwen and Maria, for both really great presentations. I think there were lots of really useful and practical tips that you offered and important things to think about in terms of evaluating programs. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. That was just two really terrific presentations, and thank you to Caitlin for organising all of this. And I particularly like the mix of really very practical applications that Maria provided, but also the really deep thinking that Gawain brought to the discussion about how this evaluation needs to be framed and the importance of it being culturally appropriate. So I think really, really interesting presentation today. As we mentioned at the beginning, this presentation will be recorded and available on the website, the NESHI website. And I've just put that up there in case anyone is not familiar with where we're located. So if you would like to go onto our website, we have a whole range of resources there that are all freely available and downloadable. If you have any questions about today's presentation, or you'd like to pose some questions to Maria, Gawain or Caitlin, then please just email us and we can let them know. We also have Twitter and Facebook, and NESHI does release a e-newsletter every couple of weeks. So if you'd like to sign up for that, once you hit our webpage, then you will be invited to sign up for the newsletter as well. So with that, I think we have run out of time. So I'm sure you'll join me in thanking everyone. Caitlin's report should be out early next year, but we do have some great little, where are they? Little booklets that just cover her fellows, what she's doing in her research. So again, they're available if you'd like one of those. And thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Sarah.